Okay, so a lot of people joining right at 10. If you could introduce yourselves in the chat, name, where you're calling in from, and something you're proud of related to trees this year. And I'll write that in the chat too.
And I just threw some links in the chat for resources I'll be talking about, but we can re-put those in the chat later for people who join.
That's great, Nancy. Thanks. And a couple more people joining. So I'll just let them in, and I'll just say one more time, for folks who are just joining, we're just doing some intros in the chat. This is the last UEC meeting of 2022. So if you could put your name, where you're calling in from, and something you're excited about related to trees or something you're proud of from this past year. Today we are recording the call, so just be aware of that. And we have Nancy Sonti with us, so I will go ahead and read your intro. So Nancy is a research ecologist with the U.S. Forest Service Northern Research Station. She's based at the Baltimore Field Station, where she works as an interdisciplinary researcher studying urban social ecological systems. Nancy works to build collaboration between academics, community groups, and government agencies in order to support the research activities of the Baltimore Field Station. Her current research interests include processes of forest restoration and regeneration, including the historical trajectories of urban forests, as well as motivations for engagement with urban green spaces. Nancy has a master's in conservation biology from Columbia University and a PhD in plant science from the University of Maryland, College Park. Thank you so much for being here with us, Nancy, and you can go ahead and test out those slides, and we're looking forward to hearing your presentation today.
Thanks, Erica. All right. Well, I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me. It's been a while since I've presented at UAC. I think it was about 5 years ago, and I shared some of my research on the human use and perceptions of urban natural areas. And it sounds like there was interest in that topic again. And I decided to kind of build out the presentation to encompass social and biophysical aspects of urban natural areas, forest patches, those kind of wilder areas that we have in cities, and talk about a variety of projects that I'm doing with many colleagues that are in all different stages as well, some in the planning stages and planning for future remeasurements, some are underway. A lot of this work was done with colleagues from the U.S. Forest Service, from my unit in the Northern Research Station, as well as others from some local city partners, nonprofits, and I'll try to mention folks as I go throughout the talk. And I want to thank Rich Hallett, my colleague, for many of these first slides about urban silviculture. So I'm going to start with some kind of conceptual, framework for this idea of urban silviculture that we've been advancing with various networks throughout the region. And this comes from a paper from my colleagues, Max Piana, Clara Pregitzer, and Rich Hallett, advancing management of urban forested natural areas towards an urban silviculture. So of course, in this community of practice, we all know that there's so many different site types for urban green space, right? It's not just those individual street trees or trees in landscaped areas, but we also have natural areas in cities. And all of those site types occur across public and private lands, different land uses and ownership regimes that make a big difference in terms of access, perception of those spaces, and management of those spaces. And then within the natural areas, we have a variety of conditions that we find the forest in, right? Different stages of disturbance, regeneration, different levels of forest health and structure. And so we're trying to really advance a conversation about the need for management of those natural areas, because sometimes they're just left alone to sort of fend for themselves, right? And the thought is, well, they're green and they can just kind of the forest can take care of itself. But without active management, that's not necessarily the case. So this comes from Rich Hallett, this idea of bringing out the traditional definition of silviculture, as put forward by the U.S. Forest Service. And sometimes when we introduce the idea of silviculture to urban practitioners, there's kind of a backlash, like this is not something we would do in cities. There's all of these practices that won't be accepted by the public, by policymakers. But really, silviculture is a very broad, holistic practice, and it can be adapted truly to the management goals of the landowner or the surrounding community. And so it's not just about timber harvest, right? It's about setting goals and desired outcomes, setting targets perhaps for wildlife habitat, biodiversity, productivity, biomass, and other ecosystem services, and then creating a management plan to reach those desired outcomes and ideally to have a sustainable forest with some intervention, but perhaps cost-effective intervention, right? And to apply limited resources in a way to make use of natural processes. And so some of these practices, we typically, we X this out to show that you don't have to engage in all of these practices for it to be silviculture, right? And many of these are not going to be accepted in the urban context. But with that being said, there are cities that are thinking about thinning when appropriate for forest health, right? And so even though we have tree canopy goals, of course, and taking out trees, especially native trees, can sometimes be a difficult idea to put forward. There's times where that's going to improve the health of the forest and the surrounding trees and end up with healthier, more robust canopy in the long run. And even prescribed burning, in many cities is something that would be part of the native ecosystem. And so in those natural areas, there's some movement towards considering those practices as well. And ideally, this urban silviculture kind of sits between rural forest management, traditional silviculture practices, and the urban forestry community. And there's a knowledge exchange in both directions, right? So we're not just taking those rural practices and bringing them into the city, but we all know that we face a lot of pressures in urban green space that apply to rural areas as well, right? We have the urban heat islands, we have intensified effects of climate change, fragmentation and invasive species pressure, heavy deer browse in many areas now. So a lot of what we're learning can be shared back out with the National Forest System and others. And so ideally having this exchange go in both directions is really beneficial. We recently published an urban silviculture guide, and I can pop that link back in at the end. This is available online. It was produced by the Natural Areas Conservancy, which is based in New York City, with funding from the Forest Service. And this is one of many sort of conceptual frameworks within the guide, just to help folks think through how you might implement silviculture in the city. And these are, pretty basic steps, but it can be helpful to just think through different options when it comes to assessment. Is that on the ground? Is that remote sensing, mapping based assessment, moving towards what are the goals for any particular property? And that might vary quite a bit. There might be sites with much more human use and programming, and maybe goals for recreation and or even meditation and event planning, versus more remote sites where there's less access from the public. And walking through that process of thinking about how to match available resources with those goals and plan out a time frame that makes sense, and then how to implement that work and how to assess it, again, to feed back into ideally an adaptive management framework. And of course, we recognize that the sort of menu of options that we have from traditional silviculture, a lot of those approaches need to be adapted for the city, right? You wouldn't just bring them over, port them over, exactly as they might play out in a national forest, but they're a starting point, I guess, for conversation and thinking about how management of a forest is different from a single tree arboriculture type of approach that many cities have focused on traditionally, or that's where they've put their resources. Here's some more figures from the guide, just illustrating that the idea of silviculture is really to use the natural ecological processes of disturbance and regeneration to work with those, right? To sort of most effectively use limited resources to get a desired outcome in the forest. And that disturbance can be at varying scales, right? It can be large scale land clearing, or it can be small canopy gaps, single tree fall canopy gaps. But we know that in the urban context, if that site of disturbance is left alone, we won't necessarily get back to a diverse native mature forest canopy that we want, right? We have invasive species pressure, we have deer browse, other types of human disturbance and vandalism potentially. And so the forest needs our help along the way. And so making that pitch, making that argument to policymakers and funders, we've found is something that's really been needed by our partners who are working on the ground, right? The practitioners know that, but sometimes we need some research to show the difference. On the right, you see this just cartoon illustrating the difference between active management and no management of a natural area. And this may seem obvious, but we realize that there's a lack of information about the ecosystem services and benefits of degraded and healthy forest in urban areas, right? We know that green space has benefits compared to pavement, but that's so coarse. And we're actually at a point where we need to be able to show whether it's cooling benefits, water use, or even, sociocultural ecosystem services, people's perceptions of these spaces. And I'll get back to that a bit later in the talk, but are there differences between healthy forest with diverse structure versus an invaded forest? And that is what's going to help make that argument for increased funding for maintenance and restoration of these spaces. So moving from kind of theory into practice, I'm just going to talk about a couple projects that are going on. We have, this is a network that we've established, the Northeast Urban Silviculture Network, including the colleagues I mentioned earlier, and also Tara Trammell from the University of Delaware is the lead on this project, is a lead on a grant that we got from the Forest Service, state and private forestry. And we have kind of convened academic, municipal, and institutional partners from locations up and down the region to initiate a few different projects. But one big question that we're tackling is looking at southern provenances of chestnut and white oak compared to local genotypes to see if this might help with forest restoration in future conditions under climate change. And so we have acorn collection from some of these locations. And in addition, we have locations further south down in Kentucky and Georgia to compare, right, to understand how the seed source and then the parents of the individual trees affect the form of the trees, their survival, their performance. And we're doing that in a couple different ways. We have a canopy gap study. So as I mentioned, sometimes we have small scale disturbance in these natural areas with just one or two large trees coming down. And so for that study, we're targeting relatively healthy forests, but where that gap might be a foothold for invasive species to come in, or perhaps just other species, not oak. A lot of our forested natural areas in cities of this region are oak dominated, and that's sort of the desired species composition for many ecosystem services, wildlife benefits, et cetera, right? But there can be a transition away to maple, tulip poplar, beech, other species. And so we're trying to see if planting some of these climate adapted oaks and canopy gaps is a way to help sustain these urban oak forests into the future. We also have what we're calling oak orchards. So these are going to be open spaces that are in a more controlled setting where we'll really be able to make careful physiological measurements across, a more controlled setting for 3 different sites up at Springfield, Massachusetts, Westchester, New York, and Baltimore. And I'm hoping there's folks on the call today that are involved in this network and some of these studies. We've also had a great community of practice, just discussing some of those elements of the, urban silviculture framework, particularly assessment, as cities are starting to pay more attention to their natural areas and putting out, RFPs for contractor bids to assess their natural areas, to figure out what do they want from those contractors, what kind of information is going to be most beneficial for them, again, both for management, but also for policy, for making those arguments up to, the mayor's office and things like that. Here's just some images of work that's been going on. We're in the initial stages here. We've selected our canopy gaps and our oak orchard sites, and we'll be planting out this spring. We have a big effort underway up and down the network with so many wonderful partners helping out. And then I just threw in an image here from the SAF convention that I'm sure some of you were at in Baltimore this past fall. And Ashley Bowers and I organized a day-long field tour, stopping at a bunch of sites with folks from the Forest Service, Baltimore Greenspace, sharing ideas about urban silviculture and also about community managed urban forest patches. So looking at kind of a variety of site types and again, ownership regimes that make a big difference in how to manage these spaces. We also visited Still Meadow Church, which I'll be talking about in a minute. But this was really a wonderful opportunity to share across that sort of urban rural community. We had folks coming from, Alaska, from national forests as far away as Alaska. We had silviculturalist from the South who was really interested in talking to us about issues we're facing in the city. And so it was nice to get out of kind of our urban bubble a little bit, I think, and engage folks that we don't always talk to in urban forestry. Another approach that we're thinking a lot about is nurse tree plantings. And so what I mean here is using fast growing early successional species, often willow and poplar trees, but we've also looked at black locust as well. Planting those in some really challenging sites where the soil quality may not be so good. And again, where we have a lot of invasive species and we want to get rapid canopy closure and cover the site and sort of crowd out those invasive species, get some biomass, some organic carbon back in the soil, and then over time, introduce those late successional climax species, the oaks that we want, and whether that for some sites may be a more effective strategy that actually in the long term reduces the amount of resources needed to manage the site, rather than just starting out right away with oaks and oak hickory and those kinds of slow growing species. And this is work that Rich and Max and I are doing in collaboration with our colleague Ron Selesny out in Rhinelander, Wisconsin. So again, it's been fun to kind of bring a Forest Service colleague who's not typically working in cities and get them thinking about how their science might apply to our urban areas. And so with that, I'm going to dive into a kind of a case study, how we're one location where we're testing out this strategy at Still Meadow Community Fellowship in Baltimore. And this site is really special, I think, because not only are we testing out these ecological, silviculture strategies, but we're also testing out a really community-driven project, community designed and implemented and managed just, alongside the Forest Service. So this is just a little locator map. This is a church in Southwest Baltimore that has about a 10-acre parcel property, much of which is forested. So you can see the church building, the parking lot, and quite a bit of forest and a stream there. And we actually have aerial imagery that we've been using to look at a lot of our field sites throughout Baltimore, going all the way back to 1927. And it can be helpful because, for example, we see here that much of the site was not forested 100 years ago. Whereas other sites that we work in are 100 plus years old. And those sites are often have an oak dominated canopy, even if they don't have much regeneration in the understory. Still Meadow, on the other hand, has maybe one oak in the whole forest, and not much. It's different. It's got black locust, it's got slippery elm, a couple beech trees, and unfortunately quite a bit of ash. This was Still Meadow in 2018. So not only is this site ecologically challenged, within the forest, but the surrounding neighborhood also faces severe flooding issues and has sort of been forgotten in comparison to other communities. If anyone's local to the area, this is not so far from Ellicott City flooding, which received a huge amount of attention, but not so much in these Baltimore City neighborhoods. And they feel forgotten. And the pastor of the church, Pastor Michael Martin, really wanted to make both the church and the forest a site of community resilience, of healing, and open it up for learning and for convening, bringing the community together, and a community that needs places to come together in the face of these challenges. And so we got involved with Still Meadow a few years ago, and we're excited to help them think about how to use the forest, how to restore the site. But we discovered that there's a lot of ash on the site. And of course, those ash were all in decline from emerald ash borer, and were becoming hazardous. And so unfortunately, with the onset of COVID and everyone wanting to be outdoors, it wasn't even safe to be in the forest. And so one of our first tasks was to figure out how to get those dangerous ash trees down. And we ended up bringing a sawyer from the George Washington and Jefferson National Forest, which again was just like a wonderful exchange. Him getting out into the city, seeing that these natural areas exist and that his skills were really valued. And then, and we got a kick out of having him come visit. And I think he really enjoyed it as well. We also have a lot of invasive vines, of course, English ivy climbing up many of the trees, and then lots of other species in the ground layer, and heavy deer browse. So we knew that with all the ash coming down, creating even more gaps, and open areas for those invasives to get a foothold, that it would be important to have a plan, a planting plan for what to do next. And because there's so much space here and so much need for planting, and again, it's not a site that's been forested for decades or centuries, so the soils are not great. We decided to try out this strategy of planting out early successional species. We established a tree nursery on site, and you can see these cuttings, poplar and willow cuttings, that we put directly into pots. And this was relatively easy to set up. It was all volunteer, coordinated and maintained throughout a growing season. We were there to kind of provide guidance, but the church and some students that they hired and local volunteers, actually a lot of volunteers from the University of Delaware, definitely want to acknowledge them, were able to keep this nursery maintained and to do a lot of the site prep in the forest. So one thing we wanted to test out was putting those cuttings directly into the ground versus growing them in pots for a growing season, in addition to looking at differences between poplar and willow species and genotypes within those species. We had 6 genotypes from each species. And part of the reason for using this type of planting stock is that it's so much easier to get in the ground than, larger stock. And those cuttings in particular, you can imagine, we just used a little double bar, and we had kids out there, retirees, folks that don't want to use heavy machinery. And we're really trying to see what approaches can work for different community groups, especially outside of city land, right? Outside of municipal parkland, there's a lot of desire to kind of have smaller scale, more grassroots restoration rather than large contractor-led work. Here's just a little overview of our study design. We ended up having 5 plots throughout the forest. And so I mentioned the cuttings versus the potted trees, the different species and genotypes. And then we also spread wood chips across across half of each plot to see if that would help suppress the ground cover. And this is my colleague Urel from Still Meadow with her bag full of cuttings, excited to get the baby trees rooting. And here's kind of close up of what it looks like getting those live stakes directly into the ground. So we did see some terrific growth, particularly from those potted trees. You know, there's a lot of variation across the sites. Of course, the different plots have higher and lower levels of light. So that's something that we're tracking. We measured the species, the ground layer before we planted, and we're doing that every season, and the existing trees around the plots. And I should say this is not the only planting going on at Still Meadow. These are just our research sites, but Tree Baltimore, Blue Water Baltimore have coordinated a lot of tree planting days and giveaways at Still Meadow. It's become a real community hub for urban greening. You can just see the difference between spreading those wood chips and not, that they really are doing a good job suppressing the invasive species, at least in some areas. And so it was a lot of work to spread those wood chips. We got them all from the city, from Camp Small, which is the city's wood reuse facility, and had to lug them up the hill. But again, you know, there's a trade-off between that kind of effort up front versus lots of hand weeding, especially sites like this where herbicide is not really an option. So we're seeing much higher survival from the potted trees than the cuttings, maybe not totally surprising, but both species are doing pretty well so far. And we haven't seen a big difference, at least in tree growth by wood chips. But again, that ground layer is looking different. Here's just some graphs that we've been putting together. We're analyzing the data, and hopefully soon we'll have a manuscript with our results from the first 2 years of growth. But you can see that, interestingly, in the first year, those saplings had almost 100%, you know, close to 100% survival. In the second year, there was some mortality. And so we're taking a look at where those are, and it seems like it might be areas that are a bit shaded. And so this is a kind of trade-off we're figuring out, is these early successional species may do better where they have more open conditions, right, and higher light levels. And so maybe there's a combination of planting them in some parts of these degraded forests and then underplanting more shade tolerant species around the edges. And finally, I just want to say that this coming year, we're piloting a workforce training program in urban silviculture. And so moving from, you know, we've had lots of students that the church has been mentoring and hiring, mainly in the summer, but throughout the year. And so moving towards a more formal workforce program, partnering with job placement organization in Baltimore, Turnaround Tuesday, to get a small cohort of folks ideally placed in jobs at the end of the training program and connected to all the local tree planting organizations in Baltimore. And so we're kind of testing this out, and hopefully the curriculum that we're developing is something that can be shared broadly and adapted to other locations where there's interest, because it does seem that there's a need for this kind of restoration work and not a lot of local skill set. So with that, I kind of want to transition to talking about some of the social benefits and engagement with these natural areas and the need for more information about that. I'm going to be covering a couple studies. So since the last time I spoke to UEC, these 2 papers have been published, and the New York City study in particular involves a lot of collaborators from the New York City Parks Department, the Natural Areas Conservancy, as well as our Forest Service Urban Field Station in New York. They're both, or I guess just to start out, why do we need to assess social engagement with urban natural areas? And I probably don't have to convince you guys, but we often have much more information about biophysical ecosystem services and benefits of any urban green space, but particularly natural areas. I would say we're missing a lot of that piece on the sociocultural ecosystem services, how folks engage with these areas, and who does and who doesn't, and why, right? And looking from the literature, we see that the way people engage with sort of remote wilderness areas is can be thought of as ambivalence, which is having both positive and negative feelings at the same time, and often quite strong feelings, right? So the reason that we have those feelings is because we don't have much control. Kind of by definition, the wilderness is where nature is in control. Sorry, I don't know why my slides just started advancing without me doing anything. Because we don't have control, we have sort of that feeling of inspiration and connection to non-human species, but we're also a little bit afraid, right? Because we don't know exactly what's going to happen, and it's not as programmed. So we know that this happens out in remote wilderness areas, but it was sort of a more open question about whether that happens in urban natural areas. So both of these studies use qualitative methods. The New York City study was actually kind of mixed methods, and we did have some counts of park users, but I'm going to focus on qualitative data from interviews in New York City with park users and in Baltimore with residents who lived close to urban forest patches. So in Baltimore, we like to talk about the distribution of our forest patches throughout the city and highlight the fact that a lot of them are outside of city parkland. Right. And this is something that I think varies across cities, and working with colleagues on a mapping analysis to understand how that varies. But certainly in Baltimore, we have a good amount of undeveloped vacant land and forests that lie outside of parks, and so maybe perceived differently in terms of access, or whether they're sort of meant for public use. Right. And these images show the sites of the interviews, and you can see how the forest is really integrated into the surrounding neighborhood. There's not any physical barrier to access. They're sort of part of the community landscape. And so these are the research questions that I set to answer here. How are folks using and perceiving those spaces? And how does that vary by homeownership, whether primarily single family homeowner neighborhood or renter apartment buildings and renters? And management regime, meaning city parkland versus more vacant, undeveloped land outside of city parks. Just briefly, these are the 4 case study sites for these interviews, and you can see how they vary with homeownership and management across 4 different neighborhoods. And here are the demographics of that survey sample. And so that, the design of this study did not sort of get an even spread of race and ethnicity or gender. And so I think that's something that could be explored further, is to make those comparisons in Baltimore. But essentially what I found was that most of the residents I talked to don't ever go into the woods, but that doesn't mean that it's not important to them to live near it, right? And many people talked about being close to the woods and viewing it from their home, from their porch, even if they didn't go inside. Peripheral users were folks that maybe went in once, or like to walk their dog along the edge, but don't regularly use the forest patch. And similar results across homeowners and renters, even though we often think of renters as being more transient. These are some of the main themes that came out, and I'll kind of go into each of them briefly, but people had positive and negative, again, ambivalent feelings about each of these. And again, similar across homeowners and renters. So it's, even though renters may not have lived there as long, they may be seeking out the forest or certain aspects of their, surrounding neighborhood as they move. Perceptions of wildlife, people have really evocative words to talk about the animals that they interact with, and whether they want to be or don't want to be close to wildlife. And some people have the same positive and negative feelings about wildlife, just, from the same person, right? Depending on what the wildlife is. Aesthetics, again, that is something that brings people sometimes that sense of peace and refuge and escape, but it can also be what makes them nervous or it feels messy, right? So understanding exactly how people perceive the edge of the forest is something that we're actually talking to Baltimore Greenspace more about in the new year, whether sort of curating the edge can be a way to draw people in and make them view the forest more favorably. Identity was a big theme, whether they identify as a nature person or not a nature person, right? It can kind of go either way. But again, this is where renters versus homeowners, you might be a homeowner for 30 years, but you never went into the woods across the street because you're not a nature person. Or conversely, you've moved around the city, but you're always seeking out nature wherever you live. And social functions. So the unprogrammed nature of natural areas, again, can be seen as a positive or a negative, right? It allows for free play for kids, which is really valuable, privacy, but also can cause some fear. So in conclusion, we are finding that these patches provide a true wilderness experience to people in the city, but there is that ambivalence, that push and pull. I didn't mention, but the results were pretty similar across the city-owned and managed forest versus the vacant land, which is interesting. The only major difference was people see a lot more deer in the city-owned forest, and that's because those tend to be connected, right, as part of a larger greenway that the deer have access to versus isolated pockets of vacant land. But those isolated pockets often have a healthier understory to tie it back to the biophysical qualities. And so I think we need more research to understand whether people perceive those differences. So moving on to the New York City study, this was a larger study, but very rapid interviews, 5 minutes or less, with 955 park users across 21 parks, and where we asked some quick questions. What are you doing here today, and why do you ever go in the woods or the wetland area, and if no, why not? So some things to highlight. I'm kind of summarizing the findings by the landscaped area of the park versus natural areas. And so in the landscaped areas, people are much more likely to be there with kids versus the natural areas, right? And then conversely, in the natural areas, they're much more likely to be doing nature recreation, which makes some sense. That could be birding, but it could be crabbing, wildflower, collecting, picking, looking for shells, things like that. And why do you come here? Proximity is always a common answer. So people go to parks that are near them, and that raises a lot of questions of equity and access, right? But in the landscaped areas, they're there for open space and more likely for socializing versus the natural areas for a sense of refuge. Themes of place attachment come out. It reminds them of other experiences in nature, earlier in life. And that's something that comes out a lot as people's previous experience in natural areas informs, their behavior as adults. We found differences in park use by gender. So these are just a couple of themes I wanted to draw out, that women are more likely to be there with children than men are. And women are also more likely to be focused on amenities. And those kind of seem to go hand in hand, right? Women who are in the park with kids are worried about certain facilities being appropriate for kids, and that may affect whether or not they consider going into the natural areas. We asked, do you ever go into the woods or the natural area? And if no, why not? And so we saw, again, pretty big differences by gender here. And when we asked why not, we see that for men, it's more likely to just be a preference, like it's just not my thing. I don't really have any need to go in there. Whereas for women, there's more specific barriers that they're talking about. Fear, access issues, safety issues, and worried about whether it's appropriate for kids if they're with kids. And so I guess I want to highlight that the idea of bringing more kids into the woods is a great one, but we need to think about their caregivers, right? If the caregivers don't feel comfortable, then we're not going to get the kids out into nature. And the potential theme here is folks who kind of said, well, I've never been there, but I might, I just haven't got around to it yet, or maybe I would go if someone would show me around. That's something that I heard across both studies, is a willingness to explore, but sort of wanting an introduction to those spaces. And finally, we had an interesting finding that so men and women were equally likely to be participants in environmental stewardship. We just asked them, do you do any environmental stewardship or volunteer work? And both men and women who were engaged in that stewardship work were more likely to go into natural areas. So not so much a gender difference in this study, but a link between environmental stewardship and use of natural areas, and maybe greater comfort or feeling more ownership of those spaces. So I want to make sure that I leave some time for discussion and questions. So I'll wrap up that, we are kind of establishing that urban natural areas offer unique benefits, different from the landscaped areas of parks, right? They're places of refuge. People are seeking out nature experiences. They feel deep place attachment. But there's barriers there. And I think we need more research on what those barriers are like, whether they're physical, whether they're psychological, social barriers, and how that varies across space and time. We find differences by gender, and that partly stems from the idea of women being caregivers and often being in parks with children. But there's a lot of potential. People are expressing a lot of willingness to explore these spaces that may be, yet untapped. So there's active discussion with New York City Parks Department, Natural Areas Conservancy about revisiting this study. It's actually going to be the 10-year anniversary since there was a citywide ecological assessment of establishing plots in all the natural areas of the city, paired with this social assessment. And so we're thinking about whether we want to repeat something similar, or what are other directions that we want to go into. Do we want to understand? We know that we need better demographic information. So, our gender is binary. We need self-reported gender, self-reported race and ethnicity, which we didn't get the first time around because these were rapid interviews in the field, self-reported age, so we can look at those differences. We've talked about general population survey versus park users, right? Are we just talking to folks in and near the park, or do we want a citywide survey that asks about natural areas, which I would say with the caveat that it can be sometimes difficult to explain to people what you're talking about if it's just, it's not something they think about or have experience with, versus standing there pointing to it and saying, hey, what do you feel about the woods over there? And then what's the role of programming? And whether that's stewardship programming, K through 12 education, adult education types of programming, or the restoration work. Are people perceiving differences once there's been restoration work in a natural area or not? There's a lot of interest from our New York City partners in understanding more about that. And I'd love to hear from folks here what your burning questions are on these topics. So with that, I'll wrap up. Thank you so much. And this was really fun to put together. So I'm glad I got to share.
Thank you so much, Nancy. That was just jam-packed with all kinds of good stuff. So I'm really excited about that. And yeah, I invite everybody, if you have questions, if you want to turn your camera on, if you want to make a comment, please feel free. I'm going to start with just tracking some things in the chat, if that's okay. The first question was actually from me. Are there opportunities to join the Northeast Urban Silviculture Network? Are there any more sites needed?
We have our sites, for the upcoming field season, I think, but there's absolutely opportunities to join, and we kind of are using it. We're branching out into additional studies. Like, for example, we have in Westchester and Hartford, Connecticut, we're kind of talking about designing studies more specific to those locations. So yes, absolutely. Please reach out if you're interested.
Awesome. And then I see some support for refining definitions of urban green spaces and maybe doing that in the DC area. I'm seeing Steve from Syracuse saying a little bit about how there's some benefits of active management versus no management. That was maybe from more the beginning of your presentation. And then there's some really great intros. Thanks everybody for your really cool intros as well. The next question from Carol, are you also planting understory/herbaceous in the nurse plantings? And I see Carol, so if you want to just ask your questions out loud, you're more than welcome to do that too.
We're not yet, but we are talking to Maryland DNR Forest Service and Baltimore Green Space about adding in those herbaceous species. And it's something that we're kind of thinking about down the line about adding those in.
What I'm interested in, especially with that, if I could elaborate, are two things. And one is armoring the edge of the forest patch to help keep the invasives back, where you have that sunlight coming in. And then the other thing is I've been wanting for years to try some side-by-sides, just like you did the cuttings and the potted trees, to do some trees planted with their appropriate understory and trees without, and see how that goes.
Yeah. Well, and I'm curious when you are thinking about edge plantings or anyone else, because we've been wrestling with herbaceous versus woody and whether to do shrubs, something that also is sort of a social cue that this is intentional, there's plants here, or the more ephemeral, herbaceous species. Or were you thinking a mix of both?
I would think a mix, and I would think you could get a lot of mileage out of some of the clonal shrubs. And then, a selective herbaceous, because obviously there's going to be limits to what you can do. But for that social cues, boy, that Christmas fern is just really tough and goes anywhere and is happy. And it's something that everybody can understand.
Yeah.
They don't have to be introduced to it. So, I think you could maybe have it's like putting in a backbone. You're not putting in the whole structure of the organism, but you're hanging that backbone that things can come and connect up to.
And that's a great idea to test out the, areas with understory plantings versus not.
Great, thanks. And Carol asked if anyone has done successional planting with Eastern red cedar as well. Is that part of the same question?
Well, I was just interested again, because it's a species that seems very, very tolerant of a lot of things. It's narrow. It's not going to close the canopy for you. But, it just seems to persist in the urban environment, and it is an early successional species. So it just seemed like a good, and somebody responded that they are using it.
That was me. We have a southern boundary in Boston at the Boston Nature Center where we have it's kind of like a row of Eastern red cedar. So I'd like to get some of those other species in there and not just be planting that. But it was a good decision made, I think, a few years ago by our property manager here. So we'll see how it turns out. I mean, we just planted some of those with Power Core Boston too, as well. And we're planning kind of a pocket forest in front of some of those in a place where we're removing some gravel. So a little scrappy, but we are trying it out, and I can let you know how it goes.
Right.
Someone asked, did you document the cause of mortality in the second year beyond the shade?
So that we're analyzing the data right now, and I think we're going to be looking at the shade is just like anecdotally as we're doing the measurements, we kind of are thinking that might be an issue, but we actually have the light measurements. So we're going to be analyzing that as a covariate. And we did notice, what was it? I think Norway maple. There were some species that we were wondering if they were allelopathic or, something going on there. So we're also going to be looking at sort of proximity to existing trees to see if that might be an issue.
Awesome, thanks. And then there's some more comments in the chat about visibility and woodland seeming cleaner with invasive control. So just want to mention those. And then some folks asking, like, what do you consider natural areas? This question is specifically NYC, and thanks Novum for supplying the natural areas map. That's a really great tool. So hopefully that answers that. But Nancy, did you have any thoughts on
Yeah.
like what you consider a natural area?
Well, I guess I'll just highlight that in the last few years, there's been so much activity around this topic across so many cities. There's a Forest in Cities network that the Natural Area Conservancy is convening, and I know some folks here are involved in that. New York City is certainly involved in that. And it's an interesting question because I think it's common. A lot of people are like, what are the natural areas in the city? What are you talking about? And so there's little pockets of practitioners in many cities who are kind of operating in isolation and getting to meet each other and share knowledge. They've just been so hungry for it, I guess. And so it's been great to see that. It started as 12 cities, and I want to say it's up to 17. And that's nationwide, not just in the East. So that's been really wonderful. New York City is a trailblazer in that regard. They started their natural resources group back in the 1980s. Novum, works with them, and she shared a link, but there's just vast natural areas in New York City. I mean, obviously it's a large city, but there's forest, there's upland forest, maritime forest, wetlands, meadows, just so many different site types. And it's taken a while maybe for that part of their agency to get like the same recognition and resources, but they're doing incredible work. But yeah, Novum, feel free to hop in.
Oh, yeah, thank you, Nancy, for that introduction. Yes, so we have a lot of forests actually in all 5 boroughs of the city, including Manhattan. And we also have globally rare ecosystems as well, like serpentine grasslands. So yeah, like I hope that folks take the time to explore the map. I've dropped a link to the Forest in Cities network as well, because New York City is not alone. There are also a lot of other cities with really amazing natural areas.
And I'll add the part of, I don't know if we have anyone from NAC on this call, but part of the goal there is that you have large parks like Central Park or Rock Creek Park in DC that have a conservancy and a lot of funding, right? But then you have all these other parks that don't get that same recognition and support. And so they are working to support all the natural areas across all of the city parks, and even working with National Park Service, parkland throughout the city, state parks, to kind of help support those smaller friends groups and even parks that don't have those at all.
In that same note, I'm going to do a little Boston representation here. We have our Urban Wilds program, which is, I think, over 30 like urban wilds, natural areas, and we're really looking forward to Boston getting into that Forest in Cities network. Maybe this year will be the year. Definitely looking for that because we have a lot of those organizations, different levels, different sizes, and some of those natural areas are more invested in historically than others. So it's good to get the woodsy people together to get us in that network and then spread the word. The next question is there a Nancy for the greater Southwest Pennsylvania Pittsburgh region?
Good question. I'm trying to think of that. So we definitely have a presence in Philadelphia, which I recognize is not next to Pittsburgh. But I think it'd be great to just connect and to kind of find out, what's going on in that region and just see if we can be supportive. Like that Northeast Urban Silviculture Network, we're kind of all located up and down the East Coast and traveling up and down and supporting different locations. So you don't necessarily need a scientist who's located right there to get involved and benefit from the work.
And I'm sure if we found an extra supply of Nancy's, we would each like one in all of our cities. So let us know if that happens. People are dropping some great links in the chat, but if anyone else has questions that they want to say out loud, now's your chance. And then I'll give a recap of our next meeting after that.
I did see this question about how do we increase incentives for permanently protecting forest patches on private and public property. And that's something, and it's important to note public property, right? Because those are not necessarily protected. And that's kind of like almost a misconception, I think, that some people have, even in a city parkland, it's not necessarily protected from development for other purposes, for recreation or anything else. So I don't know if there may be sort of nonprofit land trust folks who want to chime in here, but I know that there's sort of a lot of work around easements in different cities in these networks. Baltimore Greenspace and Casey Trees are doing a lot of great work there. And then on public property, I think setting strict limits about disturbance of forest, well, public and private property, setting criteria for disturbance of forests of a minimum size, triggering review is important, and demonstrating the benefits, that it's not just something that would be better off as a playground, right? But that the forest has benefits for the city. Does anyone else want to chime in on that?
I just put in the chat for private land, private tree canopy on in the city of Boston. The city just released an RFP like last week. We're really looking at this thing, and it's for private land. It was originally kind of framed as just tree planting on private land, but they had a RFI ahead of it, and what we were really trying to say is, like, it's not just planting of trees on private properties, it's also maintenance of existing trees, or maintenance of the trees that you plant. It's not just the planting event, and so we're thinking about that right now. It's mainly to establish an alliance of urban forestry organizations to kind of get that federal funding to the community groups who are engaged with the private landowners in the city. So I'm really excited for that. It's based on Montreal's model, which is l'Alliance. And then, I don't speak French, so sorry if I get that wrong, but that might be interesting to some folks to see if that model works. But I'm really interested in that topic as well. And I see a comment about carbon credits. Yeah, we had some big advances this year, right? In private, not private, city forest credits, and that sale of the first urban project. So that's a good comment there, Pete. I think we have 3 minutes left, so I'll give the details for the next meeting. But if people still have one more question, you might be able to get it in there. So please put in the chat or say it out loud if you think of one. We're really excited for 2023. We already have some speakers lined up. In January, we're going to plan on having Danielle Gift from the Northern Research Station. She is, I think, based in Durham, New Hampshire right now, and she used to be in New York City. So we're really looking forward to having Danielle. And then in February, and that's on January 18th, 2023. We usually do those Wednesday mornings, same time, 10 a.m. And then in February, we're thinking about having Joy Winburn, a professor at UMass Lowell, an affiliate of BU, to talk on February 15th. We still will be looking for speakers for March 15th and April 19th. And then I want to give a little shout out to Drew Powell, master's student in Baltimore County right now, who has agreed to speak in May. So we have a couple openings, we have a couple good plans, and we're really excited to keep going with this community. These meetings are really, really awesome to learn from you all. So any more questions? We have 2 minutes left.
There's this question about funding, and I just said I'm hoping that Danielle might be covering some of that since you guys are having her next year.
Yeah, I do think Danielle will be talking about that. And another great resource for that I've personally found helpful was American Forest. Joel Pannell gave a talk, which I think it's maybe recorded. We might be able to send that out about the Inflation Reduction Act funding that's coming. So I think, if I'm not misspeaking, I think it's 1.5 billion in money for urban forestry. The details of that are a little harder to parse from my level, but I think Danielle will really be primed to talk about that, and really excited for that to come in.
Great.
Thank you everybody so much for joining today, and we'll send out a recording of this video and a little recap. I'll include those links that you shared, Nancy, and maybe some other things that came up from the chat. But for everyone, Happy New Year, happy holidays, and thank you for being a part of the UEC. We really enjoy having you here. Have a great day.
Everyone.
Bye, everybody.